The moon shone brightly on the deserted highway, casting a cold, silvery light over everything. The night was quiet, and only the thud of the engine of the old sedan broke the dead silence. Abby sat behind the wheel, her face looking tired but focused. Her right leg, replaced by a metal prosthetic, rested on the gas pedal. Her life was full of struggle, and today's trip seemed to be another small victory over harsh reality. In the back seat of the car was a bag of groceries, everything she could afford to buy after a long day at work. She didn't like to drive this late, but it was always a shorter way home through the suburbs. Suddenly, the howling sound of a siren echoed behind her, abruptly snapping her out of her train of thought. Red and blue lights flashed, reflecting in the mirrors. Abby frowned, taking a quick glance at the speedometer. She was going even slower than the legal speed limit. Something was wrong. "Really?" she muttered, turning on her turn signal and slowing down. The car pulled to the curb, and she turned off the engine. The headlights of the patrol car blinded her as she sat motionless, clutching the steering wheel with her worn fingers. Questions flashed through her mind. Why did I get pulled over? What did I do wrong? Her heart beat faster, and a familiar feeling of anxiety began to constrict her chest. Soon, a tall man in a policeman's uniform approached her car, his silhouette dark and menacing. He stopped at her window, tapped on the glass with a flashlight, gesturing for her to lower it. Abby slowly turned the handle of the glass, looking at the officer. His face, illuminated by the bright light of the flashlight, expressed cold hostility. "Driver's license and registration," he said sharply, not even bothering to explain the reason for the stop. "Of course, officer," Abby replied, trying to sound calm. She reached for her purse in the front seat. The policeman was watching her every move, his hand resting insistently on the holster of his gun. His gaze was heavy and penetrating, as if he'd already convicted her of a non-existent guilt. "Why did you stop me?" she dared to ask, holding out her papers. "I'm the one asking the questions," he snapped, ignoring her. "Where have you been? Where are you going?" Abby faltered for a moment, realizing that her answers wouldn't change the way he was already set up. "On my way home from work," she said, looking straight at him despite her growing fear. The policeman leaned closer, something cruel in his eyes. He looked around the interior of the car, his gaze lingering on her prosthesis peeking out from under her pants. Her vulnerability seemed to arouse not sympathy, but a perverse interest. "Interesting," he muttered with a grin. "We'll figure out why you're here." Abby felt everything inside her clench. She knew this was no ordinary stop. Something dark was in the air, and the night, so quiet just a few minutes ago, was suddenly hostile. Abby tried to keep her composure despite the officer's icy tone and intense stare. She knew that such situations rarely ended well, but she remained calm. However, the calmness began to melt away when the officer made the first sarcastic comment. "How long has it been since you learned to drive?" he asked, leaning against the window so that Abby could smell the tobacco coming from his uniform. It wasn't very safe to drive with a prosthetic, was it? Her heart clenched painfully. His words sounded like a blow. She instinctively moved her prosthetic leg away from his gaze, as if she wanted to hide the part of herself that had long made her feel insecure. "I've been driving for years, officer," she replied in an even voice. "Many years, you say?" He chuckled. "Well, looking at this wreck of yours, I'd say you haven't traveled very far." He looked around the car as if expecting its contents to confirm his suspicions. His gaze was full of disdain, and the implication was, "You're a stranger here. You have no right to be on this road." "What do you have in the trunk?" he asked sharply, as if he already knew the answer. "There's only tools and—" she started, but he interrupted. "Tools? That sounds suspicious. I wonder what kind of tools you need? Car theft? Or maybe something worse?" His words made Abby numb. She couldn't believe she was hearing it, but there was confidence in his eyes, as if every accusation he'd made had been proven. "Do you suspect me of something?" she dared to ask. The policeman grinned, his smile devoid of any warmth. "You know, people like you are always suspicious. Too often something happens when I see—" He paused, looking her over from head to toe in a deliberate way. "Well, let's say, people like you." Abby felt the blood freeze in her veins. Every word he said was a blow to her self-esteem and dignity. She could have reacted, could have objected, but she'd been taught that resistance only made these situations worse. "Open the trunk," he ordered. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the lock button. The sound of the trunk opening carried through the silence, and she heard him step back. "Don't move," he tossed over his shoulder. Sitting in the car, Abby could only hear him start going through her things. His hands turned everything over without respect. The spare tire, the old toolbox, even her wheelchair, which she always kept in case the prosthesis hurt too much. "Well, nothing interesting," he said disappointedly, turning back to her window. "I'm surprised, though. Usually, people like you have some kind of drugs on you." Abby was in shock. It was like she'd been crushed. "It's racist," she whispered, unable to help herself. "It's called being observant," he said coolly, picking up her driver's license. "You probably think I don't care that you're black and prosthetic, don't you? But it means I should take a closer look at you." Abby stared into his face, and in that moment, all the tension of the night poured out in one frightening truth. She was alone. A lone woman in the dark against a man with a gun and the power he used to humiliate her. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her joints turned white. She was silent, knowing that every word could be used against her. "Now, get out of the car," he said coldly. Abby knew that resistance was futile, but getting out of the car on this night seemed like the beginning of something much darker. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether something similar has happened in your life. We'd love to hear your opinions and stories. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new stories. And now, we continue. Abby, trying not to show her fear, slowly opened the car door and carefully climbed out. Her prosthesis clattered against the pavement, breaking the tense silence of the night. The cold air enveloped her, but it was nothing compared to the icy stare of the officer who watched her every move as if she were a criminal. "Hands on the hood," he barked. Abby wanted to say something, to explain, but there was no hint of listening in his voice. She stepped obediently toward the car and put her hands on the cold metal. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to jump out. Slowly, very slowly, the officer continued, as if he was trying to make her feel dangerous. "I didn't do anything, officer," she began calmly, but her voice trembled slightly. "We'll see about that," he said, interrupting. "I don't like your behavior. You're too tense. What are you hiding?" He walked around her like a predator studying its prey, and then stopped in front of her, looking directly into her eyes. "Look at the way you're looking at me," he said wryly, grinning. "Are you trying to intimidate me with that look? I've seen your kind hundreds of times, all with that look, all thinking you're better than the system, huh?" Abby struggled not to say too much. She knew that one wrong word could be the occasion for more violence. "I just want to go home," she answered quietly. "Home?" He chuckled, but there was nothing funny about that laugh. "Where's home? Where every other person sells drugs, or where cars like yours are usually stolen?" Abby felt her cheeks flaming with humiliation. He wasn't just threatening her physically, he was purposefully destroying her dignity, as if he were enjoying the process. "Look, she started, but he interrupted her again. "Shut up!" His voice rose sharply, overriding her attempts to explain herself. "You're not here to talk. I told you to stand and listen." His hand suddenly grabbed her shoulder and spun her around so that she nearly lost her balance. The prosthetic made a grinding sound as it hit the ground, and Abby struggled to stand. "Is it hard to stay on your feet?" he said with a sneer. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you drove." Those words hit her harder than any physical pain. She felt helpless, unable to defend herself or respond. "You have to." She tried again, but he had already grabbed her arm, pawing it behind her back. "You know what I think?" he continued, squeezing her wrist sharply. "I think you're lying. All of you are lying. That's why you're so easy to catch." Her body protested in pain, but she knew if she showed weakness, he would only get stronger. "Officer, I didn't do anything," she said through clenched teeth. "Yeah, sure." His tone was mocking, except that nothing didn't usually look like this. His rudeness reached its limit when, without waiting for an explanation, he ran his searching hands over her clothes, ignoring her protests. "It's a violation," she shouted, finally unable to bear it. "A violation?" He grinned again. "How about you disturbing my peace with your insolence?" He stood before her, huge and commanding, his shadow looming over her, threatening to engulf her. Her mind struggled between fear and anger, but she knew there was nothing she could do now. The night seemed to stand still, watching this theater of power where Abby had no allies left. All she had was the hope that this nightmarish encounter would end before her strength ran out. Abby was still standing by her car, her hands on the hood shaking with tension and cold. She couldn't see the officer who'd come around the back of her car, but every sound of his footsteps echoed in her head like a thump. Her breathing was rapid, and she could feel the fear gradually turning to despair. "No resistance, understand?" he said sharply, but his tone made it clear that he was not looking for obedience, but for a reason to act. She barely had time to nod before she felt his rough hand grab her shoulder, pushing her to the side. Abby staggered, her prosthetic struggling to keep her on her feet. "Officer, please, I'm doing everything you said." Her voice was quiet, almost pleading, but all she heard in response was a contemptuous laugh. "People like you always get it right, don't they?" he said wryly, grabbing her other hand. "But they still break the laws." His words were like shards of glass, cutting her from the inside. Abby tried to steady herself, but he yanked her again, and she lost her balance. Her body collapsed to the ground, the prosthesis thudding against the concrete, causing a sharp pain in her hip. She cried out, but the officer was only amused. "Does it hurt?" he said coldly, leaning over her. "Maybe this will teach you not to show off." Abby lay on the cold pavement, her hands clasped behind her back, and each movement of the officer made her more and more painful. She tried to explain herself, but her words were drowned out by his loud voice. "You think you can drive this wreck like normal people?" he continued, his voice growing louder and louder. "You think your little leg problem gives you the right to pity?" He grinned as if he found something funny about her position. His hand pressed roughly on her shoulder, forcing her harder against the ground. Abby felt her cheek touch the asphalt, its coldness chilling her to the bone. "Officer, I'm asking you," she began, but he interrupted her. "Shut up." His voice was sharp as a whip. "You're in no position to ask for anything." Abby tried to lift her head to look into his eyes to find the slightest sign of humanity, but instead she saw only an expression of utter disdain. He held her like a puppet thrown under his feet, and his strength overwhelmed her completely. "Do you even realize where you are?" He spoke, letting go of her hand, only to grab her roughly by her clothes again and pull her closer to him. "These aren't your neighborhoods. There's no place for people like you here." The words cut her, but not as badly as the pain shooting up her thigh from the awkward angle the prosthetic had taken. She struggled to hold back tears, realizing that any sign of weakness would only make things worse. "I just want to go home," she repeated, her voice shaking. "Home?" He grinned. "How about prison? You'd feel right at home there." His mocking laughter echoed across the deserted road. He pushed her again, harder this time, so that she almost completely lost control of her body. She tried to get up, but her prosthesis gave her no footing, and the officer just watched her efforts with a kind of perverse satisfaction. "You can't even walk properly, and yet you're driving," he said, shaking his head. "You're a danger to everyone." Abby felt broken. Every time she tried to get up, he pushed her back down again. The asphalt was cold, her arms ached, and her prosthesis wouldn't listen, but the pain in her body was nothing compared to the humiliation tearing inside. "You don't seem to be learning anything," he finally concluded, pulling out the handcuffs. He slid them over her hands with such force that the metal dug into her skin. Abby bit her lip to keep from screaming, but everything inside her was screaming. She was helpless, crushed not only physically but mentally. "You'll lie here for as long as I say," he threw one last time before walking away, leaving her on the cold ground. The night seemed to be watching, but no one came to her aid. Her only spectator was the one who enjoyed her suffering, turning her life into a nightmare. Abby was still lying on the cold asphalt, her wrists cuffed and her body covered with abrasions and bruises. The night around her seemed bottomless, but in the distance she could see movement. The silhouettes of people gathered nearby to watch. Passers-by slowly gathered on the opposite side of the street, hushed like a flock of birds afraid to interfere. No one came closer. No one said a word. They just watched, and Abby could feel her humiliation becoming part of their evening spectacle. The policeman standing over her also noticed the audience. It seemed to irritate him even more. His face contorted into a grin, and something sinister flashed in his eyes. He lifted her by the shoulder, jerking her to her knees but not allowing her to fully stand. Her prosthesis clattered against the ground, giving her no stability, and his hands gripped her as if she were an inanimate object. "Look at her," he said loudly, turning to the crowd. "Another victim of the system, huh? People like her always know how to play the innocent." His words echoed through the silence of the night, each one a blow to her soul. She lowered her head, trying not to meet the crowd's gaze. Her face burned with shame, and her body trembled not only from the cold, but from the feeling of being exposed in front of all these people. "Get up," he shouted, yanking her so hard she almost fell again. "Or is that hard for you to do with your iron leg?" Abby tried to get up, her hands sliding to the ground and her prosthetic arm refusing to obey. Her body was exhausted, but she knew that if she didn't obey, The consequences would be worse. Gathering the last of her strength, she got to her feet, but immediately felt a policeman grab her by the hair, forcing her to turn toward the crowd. "Look, this is what they look like," he said, grinning, and ran his hand sharply through her pockets. "Criminals who think they can get away with anything?" Abby shuddered at the roughness of his touch, her body resisting, but her strength had already left her. His fingers fumbled through her pockets, ripping out whatever was in them and throwing it to the ground. Keys, cell phone, change, it all flew at the feet of the crowd as if he wanted to put her on display. "What do we have here?" he said, picking up her phone and looking at it defiantly. "Probably stolen, right? Why would anyone steal something like that?" His words elicited light laughter from the crowd, and the sound tore Abby up inside. She knew it wasn't these people's fault, but their laughter only added to her humiliation. She felt like she was being turned into an object, into something that deserved neither respect nor sympathy. "Let's see what else you've got," he continued, grabbing her shoulder and turning her back to the crowd. His hands reached roughly for her jacket, unbuttoning it and pulling it off her despite her weak protests. "Stop it!" Abby shouted, finally pulling herself together, but her words were drowned out by his loud laughter. "Enough?" he mocked, stepping close to her. "You probably think you can order me around, don't you? People like you always think they know the law better than I do. But you know what? I'm the law around here." He turned to the crowd, as if inviting them to appreciate his work. The crowd stood silent. Some turned away, some whispered, but no one approached to stop it. Her heart pounded with anxiety, but there was no way out of this hell. The officer turned to Abby again, grabbed her arm, and roughly pawed her back again. He leaned in close to her ear, his voice low but soaked with venom. "Remember this moment, because you are here for all of them. People need to see what happens to those who are out of place." Abby couldn't hold back the tears. She felt her body shaking, and the tears rolled down her cheeks, falling to the ground. The night was merciless, and the people around her were silent. She was alone, humiliated, crushed, and every breath she took seemed like a heavy burden. The crowd watched, but no one made a move to help. Abby had no hope for anyone anymore. At that moment, she realized this wasn't just a stop. It was a show of power that no one was going to challenge. Abby could barely stand on her feet, her body shaking with pain and humiliation. The handcuffs were digging into her wrists, leaving deep red marks. She tried to hold back her tears, but every attempt to hide them only made her chest ache more. Someone in the crowd was still whispering quietly, but no one made the slightest move to intervene. Everyone was petrified as they watched one man tear apart what was left of her dignity. The policeman seemed to have lost all semblance of control. His face was filled with an anger that he didn't even try to hide. He stepped close to Abby and pushed her so that she collapsed to the ground again. Her prosthesis hit the concrete with a thud, and a sharp pain pierced her thigh. She hissed in pain, but didn't let herself scream, feeling it would only make things worse. "Get up!" He bent over her and shouted. "I said get up, or do you want me to help you?" Abby tried to rise, but her body refused to obey. Every movement hurt, and the prosthesis that had always been her support was now a source of suffering. She looked up at the officer, her eyes full of despair. "I can't," she whispered. "You can't?" he repeated, his voice sounding mocking. "What can you do but lie on the ground like a dog?" Abby felt the blood rush to her face with shame and humiliation. She tried to rise again, but at that moment the officer grabbed her shoulder sharply and jerked her to her feet. Her body trembled and she felt the pain piercing her thigh, making her involuntarily cry out. "What? Does it hurt?" He mocked her again. "It's not what you're used to feeling, is it? You're all used to getting everything for free. Prosthetics, benefits, housing. Now you're finally gonna have to work." His words cut like a knife, but Abby knew the worst was yet to come. He shoved her forward roughly, and she barely kept her footing. Her prosthesis wouldn't let her move quickly, and that only irritated the officer even more. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted, shoving her again. "I said go faster. I'm trying to—" She started, but before she could finish, she felt a sharp blow to her back. His fist hit her so hard that she collapsed to the ground again. Her face hit the concrete, and she tasted blood in her mouth. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. No one came up to stop him. He stood over her, breathing hard, his eyes burning with rage. "You think I'm kidding?" he shouted, grabbing her by her clothes and yanking her to her feet again. "You think I'm going to put up with this pathetic behavior of yours?" His hand swung up again, and this time it hit her in the side. The pain was so intense she could barely breathe. Abby tried to say something, but her words were drowned out by her own sobs. "Stop it, please," she begged, her voice weak but sincere. "Shut up," he shouted, shoving her toward the car. "You think your damn hard life gives you the right to break the law? You think I'm gonna mess with you just because you don't have a leg? That don't mean nothing." Those words were the last straw. Abby felt her world crumble. Her tears flowed nonstop, her body shook, and her soul was crushed. But the officer wasn't going to stop. He grabbed her shoulder and pinned her against the hood of the car, his hands continuing to roam her body, ignoring her protests. "Where is it?" he said, his voice full of hate. "You're hiding something. I can see it." "I have nothing," she whispered, trying with her last strength to speak. "You're lying," he shouted, slapping her on the back again. His blows grew harder and harder, his hatred more and more obvious. Abby couldn't fight back anymore. She just lay on the hood, her body broken and her spirit gone. She knew that to this man she was not a person, but an object on which he could vent his rage and hatred. The crowd continued to watch without interfering. Someone filmed what was happening on their phone, but no one came closer. No one tried to help. Abby was alone, completely in the power of a man who seemed to take pleasure in her pain. The night, which had seemed dark and cold, was now filled with the sounds of her moans and the officer's rough shouts. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. We want to know your thoughts and experiences. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. Abby was still lying on the hood of her car, her breathing confused, her body weak and her wrists burning from the handcuffs. She felt completely broken, but the officer didn't even think about stopping her humiliation. His footsteps echoed muffled, pacing back and forth as if contemplating how to crush her even more. "You think you can just get away with this, don't you?" He finally stopped next to her car door, his voice filled with venomous contempt. His voice was filled with venomous contempt. "But I see what you are. You're all the same. Lying, breaking the law. You think you can get away with it just because someone in your past took pity on you." Abby wanted to say something, but her voice caught in her throat. Every word he said resonated with her pain, reminding her that she was completely helpless here. The officer, meanwhile, opened her car door and peered inside, his movements sharp, rough, as if he were looking for something specific. "What you got there, huh?" he muttered, pulling her bag from the front seat. He held it like it was evidence of some crime, his face contorted into a mocking grin. "There's bound to be something in this wreck," he continued in a louder voice, addressing the crowd rather than Abby. "Drugs, weapons, maybe some stolen goods. What do you think? What do you think she's hiding here?" The crowd remained silent, but someone in the distance shouted something which only encouraged the officer. He opened her bag abruptly and began shaking out the contents onto the ground. Keys, wallet, medication, a pack of tissues, all of it fell to the cold concrete, scattered in disarray. "Oh, what do we have here?" he said with feigned surprise, picking up the bottle of her painkillers. "A drug addict, huh? Is that why you can't stand on your feet? Your leg has nothing to do with it. It's all your shit." Abby shook her head, her voice finally breaking through the fear. "It's medicine. For pain. I'm an amputee. It's prescription." Of course," he interrupted with a wry laugh. "Everybody's got 'em by prescription, only it's strange that I see it in people like you. Where's the recipe? Show me." Her heart sank. The recipe had stayed at home, in her locker, where it had always been. She hadn't even thought she might need to prove something so obvious. Her silence only reinforced his suspicions. "That's it," he concluded, clutching the bottle in his hand. "Catching another criminal. Breaking the laws in your blood. No surprise there." He tossed her bag on the ground like unwanted trash and began rummaging through the other things that had fallen out of the car. He picked up an old frame photo of her with her family and hummed. "Who's this? Are they all the same? They're probably at home, planning how to get you out of jail, aren't they? I'm sure it's not the first time they've done it." Abby could feel her hands shaking and the tears coming to her eyes again. She tried to move to gather her things, but he leaned toward her and pushed her back. "Don't you dare," he growled. "I'm not done yet. Maybe I missed something. Or maybe you think you can fool me." His hands roughly searched the seats and drawers of the car, and every find, even the most innocuous, became an excuse for him to make new accusations. An old cell phone case he called an evidence locker. A few coins from a cup holder became evidence of her alleged dubious dealings. "It's clear," he said, straightening up and looking down at her. "You're typical. You think you can play innocent while I'm here, but I know what you are. And you know what? I'm going to make sure people like you don't feel comfortable. You're a failure of the system. And I'm going to fix it." Abby could no longer hold back her tears. She felt completely naked in front of this crowd, who continued to watch as if it were a spectacle. She was not a person, but an object of hatred and contempt, and nothing she could say or do would change that. The crowd was still silent, and in that silence she heard the siren wail of another patrol car somewhere in the distance. It was a faint hint that the nightmare might be over, but Abby knew that the wounds left by that night would stay with her forever. The officer grinned contemptuously at Abby's car, which now looked like its owner, haggard, ridiculed, as if ready to break under the weight of what was happening. Abby's belongings were still strewn across the asphalt. A phone with a cracked screen, a purse with a torn zipper, scattered small coins, all lay there as proof of her humiliation. But he didn't stop. His eyes, glittering with cruelty, glided over the car, a new plan brewing in them. "You want to know why people like you don't deserve anything good?" He spoke loudly, addressing the crowd rather than Abby himself. "Because you bring nothing but trouble. And you know what? We have ways to deal with it." Abby, head down, barely understood what he was saying. She could feel her body aching, the way each word tore her mind apart. But his next move made her look up. He walked to the trunk of her car and opened it abruptly, rummaging through her things again. His hands threw the old bag of tools to the ground with force. Her belongings, her history, her humble life, all of it lay under his boots like trash. "It's all evidence," he said with feigned satisfaction, pulling from the trunk a stack of old rags she'd used to service the car. "You leave footprints. You think you can cheat the system like everyone else." "Officer, I didn't do anything." Abby tried to speak, but her voice was so weak that his words drowned her out. "You didn't do anything?" he interrupted, turning around sharply. "Your drugs, your lies, your trash, it's all proof that you're dangerous. That's your crime. Now I'm going to show you how we deal with people like you." Abby felt a chill go down her spine as he pulled a lighter from his pocket. She couldn't believe her eyes when he leaned over the rags he'd just thrown away and flicked the fire on. The flame flared up quickly, dancing in the wind, and its light reflected in the face of the officer, who watched it with a kind of grim satisfaction. "What are you doing?" Abby exclaimed, her voice soaked with despair. "You can't. This is my car. It's all I have." "It's not your problem anymore," he replied coldly, tossing the burning rags into the trunk. The fire instantly engulfed the interior of the car, devouring the upholstery of the seats and the plastic of the dashboard. The warm glow of the fire colored everything around it in ominous shades of orange and red, and thick smoke rose into the night sky. Abby, on her knees, watched the scene with horror. Her car, her only means of livelihood, her defense against a world that had been so cruel to her, was now turning to ash. "You're crazy!" she shouted, her voice on the verge of hysteria. "This is my life. How can you do this?" "Life?" he replied with a chuckle, stepping closer. "You have no life. You exist at the expense of others. You only live because the system allows you to. But I'm here to correct that mistake." Abby tried to stand up, but her prosthesis wouldn't listen. The pain in her hip was unbearable, and the handcuffs restrained her movements. She collapsed to the ground again, tears streaming down her face. Her attempts to protest, her faint cries, were lost in the crackling of the fire and the hostile stares of the crowd, which still made no movement. "Look what you've done," the officer said, pointing to the car. "This is your punishment for deciding to play the honest man. People like you don't know what it means to be part of society." Abby could no longer speak. Her strength had left her. Her spirit was broken. She could only watch as her car, her hope for the future, turned into charred remains. The fire was devouring everything, leaving her empty-handed and with an even greater sense of loss. At that moment, the siren of another patrol car broke the silence of the night. The officer froze for a moment, his gaze intense, but he immediately returned to his former cool confidence. He took a step toward Abby, leaning closer to say one last word before he was interrupted. "Remember this moment," he whispered threateningly. "You need to know that you mean nothing, and you'll never forget this night." Her tears flowed endlessly, her world shattered, her faith in justice gone. The fire, the smoke, and the officer's cruel words became part of her nightmare, which was now reality. The night was eerily silent. Only the crackling of the dying fire and the quiet whistle of the wind reminded her that life went on, despite the tragedy that had played out on that road. Abby's car, her old sedan, was no longer a means of transportation, her protection, or a symbol of freedom. It was now a charred skeleton from which a thin, acrid smoke rose like the last exhalation of her hopes. Abby sat on the ground, leaning on her worn prosthesis, which now hurt so badly that every second of sitting was torture. Her hands, still handcuffed, trembled, and her wrists burned from the wounds left by the cold metal. She stared at the remains of the car, unable to tear her gaze away, as if trying to find something familiar, something to remind her that this was her life, her world, destroyed overnight. "That's it," she murmured faintly, her voice weak and hoarse. "It's over." But the officer wasn't listening to her. He stood a little farther away, talking to his arriving colleagues. His voice was confident, his gestures sharp, as if he were talking about how brilliantly he'd handled the situation. None of the other officers approached Abby. No one helped her up, asked how she was feeling. She was invisible. No, not invisible. She was unwanted, useless. The crowd that had gathered on the roadside began to gradually disperse. People were talking among themselves. Some kept filming on their phones, but no one stopped to help. They saw only a spectacle, another story to discuss, but not a man sitting on the ground, crushed physically and mentally. "All I had," Abby whispered, looking down at her trembling hands. "All I have left." Her words faded into the night, but they were everything. Despair, pain, hatred for the injustice she'd faced all her life. She remembered how she had raised the money for that car, how she had saved from every paycheck, how proud she was to be able to buy it. She remembered the nights she'd come home listening to music from the old speakers, feeling free, even if only for a moment. Now it had all turned to ash. What was left after the ruthless hatred of a man who thought himself superior to her? The prosthesis, which had always been her strength, now seemed a symbol of her weakness. Every movement hurt, and she hated herself for not being able to defend herself. Her mind went back to the officer's words, "You mean nothing." Those words echoed in her head, reinforcing the feeling of helplessness. "Why?" she asked aloud, but did not expect an answer. Her question was addressed to the night sky, to fate, to the world that seemed to have turned its back on her. She tried to rise, but her body wouldn't listen. Her prosthesis creaked, and the pain in her hip made every movement torture. She sank to the ground again, leaning on her arms which barely held her weight. She was alone. Completely alone. None of the officers standing off to the side came over to help her. They were discussing something amongst themselves, paying no attention to the woman who had been victimized by their colleague. Her thoughts began to jumble. She thought of her family waiting for her at home, about those who would have hugged her when they heard what had happened, but she knew none of that would happen. She couldn't afford to call anyone, couldn't explain that her car was destroyed, that she herself was broken. This was more than a trauma. It was a demonstration that she didn't belong in this world, that her life was insignificant in the eyes of the system. The lights of other cars flashed in the distance, but no one stopped. She sat there, wounded, exhausted, but her mind was still struggling. She didn't know how to move on, how to go home, how to explain what had happened, how to deal with the feeling that her life had been broken that night. The quiet sound of footsteps came from nearby. She turned her head and saw one of the policemen who had not been involved in what had happened. His face was indifferent, his gaze sliding over her as if he were looking at trash, not a person. "Call a tow truck," he threw to someone behind him, ignoring Abby. "This shit needs to go away." Her heart clenched again. Even now that it was over, she was still nothing in the eyes of these people. She wanted to scream, wanted to make them see her pain, her suffering, but her voice refused to obey her. She could only sit and watch her world drift away on the night wind. Abby lowered her head and closed her eyes. She knew this was a night she would never forget. Her pain, her humiliation, her loss, all of it would haunt her, and no matter what happened next, she would never be the same person she had been up to that point. The days after that night merged into one agonizing torrent. Abby, lying on the couch in her tiny apartment, could barely move. Her body still ached, every bruise, every abrasion reminding her of that terrible night. But the worst pain was moral, the feeling that her life, her dignity, had been torn to pieces, and no one had even tried to put it back together again. Neighbors whispered. Some of them had seen the video that one of the passers-by had posted on the internet. "Policeman apprehends trespasser," the headline said. The comments under the video were like knives that stabbed into her wounded soul. People were judging her without knowing anything about her life. She must have done something. Why was she even there at night? Typical story, pretending to be a victim. She tried not to read, but every time she turned her phone on, it was as if those words were pulling her into the abyss. Her family was furious, but even more desperate. Her mother cried, unable to understand how the system could do such a cruel thing to her daughter. Her younger sister wanted to go to the police and demand justice, but Abby knew it was useless. Every time she tried to speak out about what had happened, her story met steel walls of indifference. She went to the local human rights center, but they only gave her the cold shoulder, saying that these cases are complicated and that she would need strong legal support, which she could not afford. But the worst was ahead. The officer who had ruined her life continued to work. She had seen him on news stories where he was praised for his decisive actions. To the system, he was a hero, keeping order. No one even mentioned her car, her injuries, her pain. His report was very simple. The suspect resisted. Her actions required firm intervention. No one asked what really happened. No one wanted to know the truth. Abby tried to find a lawyer willing to take her case, but most refused. "It'll be hard to prove. The system protects its own. You'd better move on." These phrases were heard over and over again. Even those who wanted to help said the case could drag on for years, and the outcome remained doubtful. Meanwhile, her life was falling apart. She could no longer drive to work because her car had burned down, and there was no money for a new one. The prosthesis that had been damaged that night needed to be replaced, but her insurance didn't cover that expense. She was locked in her apartment, unable to move forward. The crowd of people who saw her suffering did not become her support. They were witnesses, but not allies. None of them stepped forward to tell the truth. No one wrote a statement, offered her help. The people who could have been her voice chose to remain in the shadows. The only thing that kept her afloat were the memories of who she was before that night. Abby remembered fighting for her life, for her independence after the amputation. She remembered getting behind the wheel of her car for the first time, tasting freedom. She remembered all the little victories that had made her strong, but now she didn't feel that strength. Now she was a shadow of herself. The system that was supposed to protect her had betrayed her. The policeman who had turned her life into a nightmare was only a symbol of something bigger, a machine that refused to recognize her rights, her humanity. Every time she watched the news, every time she saw this man being praised for his actions, her heart clenched with pain. Abby knew that the justice she deserved was far away, but she decided to fight nonetheless. She began to write her story, describing every detail of that night, every word, every humiliation. Her words were her weapon, her only chance to get the truth. Her story began to spread, resonating with others who had experienced something similar. People began writing to her, sharing their stories, offering support. But even this could not overshadow the sense of injustice that haunted her. Abby knew that the system would probably never change. She knew her struggle would be long and painful, but she also knew she had to tell her truth. Her pain could not go unnoticed. Her story became a symbol of something bigger, a fight against a system that refused to see people. Abby couldn't get back what had been taken from her, but she could fight so that others would not have to endure what she had to endure. And in that, she found meaning to carry on, even if justice seemed out of reach. Her life was forever changed, but her spirit remained steadfast no matter what. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really want to know what you think, because each of you is incredibly valuable to us. Please subscribe to the channel and give us a like to support our work. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good day and justice in every moment of your life.